She didn't cry. She didn't panic. Instead, Mackenzie Shirilla pressed the gas pedal all the way down and never touched the brakes. At 5:34 in the morning, her car slammed into a brick wall at over 100 miles per hour, with her boyfriend and his friend trapped inside. And while two families were grieving, she was joking about going viral. This is Criminal Women, the channel dedicated to understanding the psychology of female offenders. I drop 2 brand new cases every single week, and if stories like this are your thing, go ahead and hit subscribe right now so you never miss one. 2 people died before sunrise on July 31st, 2022. And the girl who caused their deaths spent part of that same morning posting videos on TikTok. That is not a rumor. That is exactly what happened. Dominic Russo was 20 years old. He had a family that loved him, a business he was starting to build, and a girlfriend who refused to let him go. His friend Davion Flanagan was 19, a student athlete who had been adopted at 8 years old by a woman named Jaime, who gave him a second chance at life. Davion had been out with friends that night. He only needed a ride home. He never made it. For Dominic's family, that morning would become a permanent dividing line in their lives. One moment he was alive, laughing with friends and planning the future. The next moment, police officers were knocking on the door before sunrise, delivering the kind of news no parent ever believes they will hear. To understand what happened that morning, you have to understand who Mackenzie Shirilla was. She grew up in Strongsville, Ohio, a quiet suburb where violent crime is rare. She had recently graduated from Strongsville High School and had built a following on TikTok. Modeling agencies had started reaching out. Around school, people compared her to Regina George from Mean Girls, confident, popular, and always aware that people were watching. Dominic was her boyfriend. They had been together for about 4 years. From the outside, their relationship looked typical for 2 young people figuring life out. But people close to them described something very different. They broke up and got back together repeatedly, and when arguments happened, they escalated quickly. Dominic's mother, Christine, later said the tension had become unbearable in the months before the crash. Mackenzie would sometimes show up at his house uninvited, banging on the door and demanding to be let in. Audio recordings captured her standing outside his house shouting threats and demanding he open the door. But the moment that stood out the most came just 2 weeks before the crash. A witness later testified that while driving together, Mackenzie looked at Dominic and said, "I will crash this car right now." 2 weeks later, that threat became reality. Friends later said arguments between the two could escalate quickly, often ending with emotional confrontations. Some described a relationship filled with jealousy, control, and constant tension. Looking back, several people said the warning signs were already there. They just never imagined those words would turn into something deadly. Investigators later discovered something else that raised serious questions. 3 days before the crash, GPS data showed Mackenzie had driven to the exact intersection where the collision would later happen. Progress Drive and Alameda Drive in Strongsville, near the Plidco building. She drove there, stopped briefly, and then left. The night before the crash seemed ordinary. The 3 of them attended a graduation party around 10 that evening, then later went to a friend's house where they listened to music and smoked marijuana. Around 5:30 in the morning, they finally left. 3 people got into Mackenzie's 2018 Toyota Camry. At 5:34 a.m., a surveillance camera captured the car making a slow right turn onto Progress Drive. Nothing unusual. But 1 minute later, another camera recorded the same vehicle racing down the road at full speed. The headlights cut through the early morning darkness as the car accelerated directly toward the corner of a brick building. It hit the Plidco building at more than 100 miles per hour. The impact was catastrophic. Debris scattered across the street, and pieces of the car were thrown in multiple directions from the force of the crash. Emergency responders said the damage was so severe that it barely resembled a vehicle anymore. For the officers arriving at the scene, it was immediately clear that survival would be almost impossible. Officers at the scene later said the vehicle had essentially split apart from the force of the collision. One officer, who had worked many accident scenes, called it the worst crash he had ever witnessed. Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan died instantly. Mackenzie survived. When first responders reached the wreckage, her foot was still pressing the accelerator. In the days that followed, people expected grief, silence, reflection. Instead, Mackenzie began posting videos on TikTok from her hospital bed. She filmed parts of the medical ward and joked with followers about the situation. In one clip, she joked about being someone who could take a lot of drugs and survive. When Halloween arrived a few months later, she posted images showing Dominic and Davion dressed as corpses. For their families, watching those posts appear online was devastating. Davion's sister later said something about Mackenzie's behavior felt deeply wrong, and she pushed investigators to take a closer look at what had happened. At first, detectives considered the possibility that the crash was simply an accident. Mechanical experts examined the vehicle to see if any system had failed. Nothing had. The car was fully functional. Then investigators pulled the event data recorder, the car's black box. The information it contained changed everything. From the moment Mackenzie turned onto Progress Drive, the accelerator was pressed all the way down. Maximum throttle. The brake pedal was never touched. Not once. Not for a moment before impact. The car had been driven directly into the building without any attempt to stop. GP's data confirmed she had visited the exact location 3 days earlier. Police also found psilocybin mushrooms and a digital scale in her possession. What initially appeared to be a tragic accident was starting to look very different. On November 4, 2022, officers arrived at her home with an arrest warrant. Body camera footage shows Mackenzie crying as they placed her in handcuffs. She repeatedly asked officers to be careful with her jewelry so it would not break. In the police car, she leaned back and closed her eyes. Her defense team later chose a bench trial, meaning the case would be decided by a judge instead of a jury. Judge Nancy Margaret Russo heard the evidence: surveillance footage, black box data, witness testimony, and GPS records showing she had visited the crash site days earlier. On August 14, 2023, the verdict was delivered. Guilty on all 12 counts. 4 counts of murder, 4 counts of felonious assault, 2 counts of aggravated vehicular homicide. At sentencing, the judge spoke bluntly about what the evidence showed. She said Mackenzie had transformed from a normal driver into what she described as hell on wheels. Controlled, deliberate, intentional. Mackenzie Shirilla received 2 concurrent life sentences with the possibility of parole after 15 years. Her driver's license was permanently revoked. But another disturbing detail surfaced after the trial. While in jail awaiting the verdict, Mackenzie had been making phone calls. Those calls were recorded, and in several of them, she was laughing. Not nervous laughter, casual conversation. At one point, she discussed how her case had gained international attention and wondered if celebrities like Kim Kardashian might contact her. She talked about writing a book. She complained about other inmates. She referred to herself as the 3rd victim in the crash and called the charges against her insane. Throughout those calls, Dominic and Davion were rarely mentioned. The laughter stopped the day the verdict was announced. Reality finally settled in when the courtroom grew silent and the sentence was read aloud. The same case that once seemed like online attention and headlines had turned into a life behind bars. In that moment, the attention disappeared, leaving only the consequences of what had happened. In court, Mackenzie cried as the sentence was read. Her family spoke quietly about appeals and legal options. Her mother reminded everyone that phone calls from jail were recorded. 2 families, however, would never see their sons again. Dominic Russo never reached his 21st birthday. Davion Flanagan never returned home to the woman who had adopted him and given him a future. The investigation revealed a pattern investigators believed showed planning, The earlier threat, the visit to the crash location, the black box data proving the accelerator stayed pressed until the moment of impact. Mackenzie Shirilla will not be eligible for parole until 2038. Some decisions cannot be undone, and some moments, once captured in data and recordings, last forever.